And just seeing this long continuity made me think that it might be fun to try to tell the story on a very, very large canvas.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. Every so often in this field, a book comes along that you just know is going to be really important. That was the feeling some quarter century ago when Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell's The Corrupting Sea first appeared. Even though I was just an undergraduate, I remember catching snippets of my professors' conversations about it in the department hallways at the University of Michigan. And now there is something of the same atmosphere of excitement around John Ma's much-anticipated and magisterial new tome, Polis, a new history of the ancient Greek city-state from the early Iron Age to the end of antiquity, which was published by Princeton earlier this year. And this time, I'm really excited to actually be part of the conversation. The polis as a concept has been the subject of a great deal of scholarship in the last few decades, much of which was animated by Mogens Herman Hansen's Copenhagen Polis Center. The center led to too many publications to list here, but I'll just note an inventory of archaic and classical polis compiled by Hansen himself, along with Thomas Heine Nielsen, and that's OUP 2004, and Hansen's Polis, an introduction to the Greek city-state, and that's OUP 2006. Now there's even a polis inventory app, and I'll be putting the link to where you can download it in the show notes. In his new book, though, John Ma considers the ancient Greek polis in its much longer durée, from the early Iron Age to the end of antiquity, as it says on the tin. For Ma, the 338 Battle of Chaeronea was hardly a death knell for the polis. Rather, the Hellenistic world provided just the circumstances under which the polis most flourished. So what we think of as the classical polis, or the polis in the period of Greece's 100 Years' War, as Ma has it, was really but a prelude, and not a particularly uplifting one, to the centuries of highly functional, roughly democratic polis communities that, across the Eastern Mediterranean, held on to some degree of autonomy and stateness until the 3rd century AD. When Ma's Polis first came out, Peter Toneman wrote in the Times Literary Supplement, "Polis is a vast, generous, and deeply humane book, the work of an extraordinary scholar at the peak of his powers. It is history writing at its very best." So it is truly an honor and a pleasure to have as my guest for this episode none other than that same extraordinary scholar at the peak of his powers, John Ma. John Ma was born in New York of Chinese parents. He grew up in Geneva, where he studied Greek and Latin at school and outside school. He went on to study classics, then ancient history at Oxford. He has taught ancient history and classics departments at Princeton, Oxford, and Columbia. Ma is deeply interested in studying Greek history, especially in the Hellenistic period, using documentary and material sources. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes. So now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche John Ma. The next voice you'll be hearing is his. Happy holidays.
I mean, I think I always wanted to write a book on the polis, and when I was a graduate student, I thought, I'll write a dissertation on the polis. And people said that's insane. You'll never mention that again. So of course I kept thinking about it, and it's something I've been wanting to do. To do for a long time. Specifically, of course, as I say in the preface, it comes from conversation with Josh Ober, when I noticed that the things he was interested in, namely the oligarchical pushback in the, say, mid-4th century BCE, looked very much like the things you see in Athens. It looked very much like the things you see in late 2nd century BC Athens. I think that Paraskevi Matsavu works on the tension between enormous economic wealth boom, the religious conservatism of certain circles who are in fact deeply implicated in this economic boom, and democratic reaffirmation. And just seeing this long continuity made me think that it might be fun to try to tell the story on a very, very large canvas and a very large time frame. But that, raises the question of why is it interesting to write history on these small scale polities which are very delimited, very bounded, and also which have these issues of mass and elite or the consequences of small-scale democracy and autonomy in a very, very vivid way. Why that should be interesting to us.
So what was the precise genesis of it? You started it, it came from a series of lectures.
Yes. Or no, just one lecture, which was just very unsatisfactory. It was just basically trying to put together the narrative of the Polis. And I realized that every part of this story was in motion. The Hellenistic period, of course, which I work on, is changing and has been changing for a while. With problems of autonomy and democracy. The early Iron Age and Archaic period is massively changing all the time, because of the archaeology and because of these conceptual advances in how we study the Archaic Polis. I'm thinking of two very different scholars, Alain Duplouy and Julien Zurbach, have these very, very interesting ways of looking at it. The classical period was, the work on associations, the work on slavery, the Hellenistic, the Roman Polis, the Roman Near East, and finally late antiquity. Every bit of the story was in ferment. And I thought, just to do the narrative, to try to do justice to all of these different stories and to try to connect them would be interesting. The problem is that by the time I'd finished one section, things had moved on. The scholarship had moved on already. Lately I was finishing, the last part of the book, with of course working on the analytical chapters, and the study of the Iron Age seems to have another round of renewal. It's just remarkable how, in a way, everything is in ferment and just pushing in different directions.
Well, I wanted to ask where you began writing. It's such a enormous book in terms of intellectual rigor and the depth and the texture that you bring to the narrative. So did you start at the beginning?
Yes, I'm afraid I did. The Archaic was just starting down and reading through Homer and reading through the Odyssey, starting with Menin and ending with whatever it is in book 24. I did that in Athens, in fact. So I was also visiting museums, visiting the Kerameikos, the National Museum, the Benaki Museum, looking at things and trying to think about the early Iron Age and so on. But I just started at the beginning. So much more I wish I'd done, in terms of traveling, for instance, just to see the early Iron Age. So a lot of it is this imaginary seminar or imagining traveling seminar that just took place in my head.
Oh, that's such a great way to put it. When you began writing from the beginning, what hunches did you have about the story that you would be telling or the unity of the Polis? And I'm curious about whether and to what extent those ideas might have changed as the work progressed.
That's a really, really essential question, I think, about that. You wouldn't start on a thing like this unless you had a hunch that it was a unitary story. The initial moment is this hunch that you can tell this as a single story, in spite of variation. And that variation, diversity, is meaningful in relationship to a central model of the polis, or that they represent different paths or possibilities that gradually converge, and once they converge, stay there. I think that was also one of the hunches, is that there is a crucial moment around, say, 350 to 250, where things start to coalesce. Other things are still there, but, gradually die out or turn into dead ends. And that once things get to that point, things accelerate. The sort of convergence accelerates in the, early 2nd century. And this form then proves very stable. That I think was the hunch I had. And I think it's possible to carry it out, but at a cost. The thing that I realized is that the existence of this unitary form is itself a problem, in that it covers very diverse things. And the way in which this apparent unity is maybe used strategically by very diverse actors, for instance, in the Near East, or the Roman Empire, which, is pushing this simplification, is something that gave me pause.
So what are the characteristics then of the unity, if we talk about the Greek polis in its longue durée? What is holding that idea together over so many years?
That's, again, something that gives me pause. But, the most salient features are, the institutional shell of a regularly consulted and theoretically sovereign people, plethos, mass, whatever you call it, which is theoretically inclusive of free-born males in the community. Of course, has all kinds of protocols for admission. Institutions which share power and which circulate, including a boule, including a council, which, though does sort of grow more oligarchical in the Roman period, is still an institution. It's still a body of power holders. So a human community organized on institutional lines, an urban center, and a territory whose relationship to the center is symbiotic or coterminous. I suppose those would be the basic elements that you see: human population, institutional setup, and the physical layout.
As you tell that story in the book, one of the characters that keeps springing up is Aristotle, and you seem to be really thinking with Aristotle. Could you say a little bit about how his ideas about the polis and about political life shaped the arc of your book?
Aristotle was also a companion from the conception of the book, which in fact I started writing or taking notes for at the time I was writing a book on honorific statues in the Hellenistic world, which is also a book about the polis. In a way, this is just this book writ large. This is really about the politics, even though the Nicomachean ethics and so on have really interesting insights into civic ideology. But this Aristotelian simplification down to institutional power, which of course is something that's very problematic, that makes people ask, well, what about religion? What about gender? What about associations? What about informal power? And all these things, is an issue I try to grapple with, are, in my view, an Aristotelian view, present but shaped very deeply in a constitutive way by who has access to institutional power. To put it simply, elections matter. And the elections matter. Who controls institution, who controls the law will matter. And that, the very simple equation is, if the majority controls, it will actually tend to pass measures that favor the majority. That means redistribution to provide public goods, and that means a sort of soft pedaling of the enforcement of economic rights, of contract rights. Whereas if the few are in power, they tend to enforce contracts very strictly, and they tend to evade taxation, redistribution. They tend to favor certain types of display of wealth, and so on. And, of course, we live in an Aristotelian world, in a way, right, where the control of judicial institutions, but also the control of, who determines what happens with taxation is absolutely central to our debates. And then a lot of obfuscation happens around this issue, which precisely shows how important it is. So that's, I suppose, why Aristotle was at the center of the book. There's this insistence on institutional power being very important and constitutive.
Well, it's also so interesting that he's someone who is thinking really toward the beginning of what you call the long classical period, or at the start of this period within that, where that's characterized by a phenomenon that you call the Great Convergence.
Yep.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this book is the way that it challenges maybe some long-standing problematic ideas of the periodization of Greek history. You introduce slightly different vocabulary, at least it's different for me. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see the arc of the periodization, about how you divide up the book just really on a structural level. For you, what is the Archaic period? What is the Classical period? What are some of these terms? The Great Convergence, or the 100 Years' War, or the Indian Summer of the Polis. These are all really interesting terms.
I hope they have high annoyance value so that they'll stick in people's mind. And that was the assumption. They're also, of course, not. They're also very familiar to those who work in, say, the tradition of Louis Robert and Philippe Gautier this feeling that, and also Fergus Miller speak of convergence, had a feeling about this, that the world between 350 and 150, say, it shows a strong unity in spite of the undoubted rupture represented by the end of the Achaemenid Empire and the rise of the Hellenistic kingdoms. But it's a question of scale. If you look at the cities, then the things that fall into place in the late classical period are very, very durable. And Aristotle was a witness to that. He was, there at the creation of that particular form of the polis. Even though he himself has his prejudices and obsessions of a well-born or rich elite man of the 4th century, all these concerns about, is virtue teachable, all that sort of crap. It's actually stuff he's really, really worried about. But he is there at the creation of the polis, of the Great Convergence, with all of its compromises and choices and simplifications. So that periodization is familiar to a certain school, I think, of Hellenistic history. Once you accept that, then you have a very short classical period before that. There's a weird 5th century, what I call the 100 Years' War, which is, of course, the classical period we like most, and which produced the great literature and everything, where the long classical period is, in fact, Orson Welles' cuckoo clock. They actually have stable institutions, democratic compromise, and the work of art they produce mostly is thousands of honorific decrees that attest to, the social contract actually working. Whereas the, short classical period has things in play, very much in play across the board in very many places from Syracuse to Asia Minor. Like tyranny or principalities is actually something that's viable in this period. A lot of people are trying it, and they pop up all over the place. In a way, that period just works out the contradictions of the Archaic period, especially the 6th century BC, when, the polis has coalesced and we now see what the issues are. For instance, the issue of law, for instance, the issue of what is citizenship versus, say, single rule, and so on. So, I have a, kick-off period in the 6th century, a classical period which works these things out, and a long classical which then has prolongation to the Roman period because it's such a durable form. The 7th century, I think, is a crucial period, which is one that we don't see very well because you have what I call the leap to the state that occurs in this period, and it's still very, very mysterious. I think the 7th century is a crucial period that needs illumination. Say, the difference between late geometric Athens and Athens by 600 is very great. And the understanding the phenomenon of consolidation and institutionalization, I think, is really, really important challenge.
Well, for the Archaic period, could you say a little bit about what you see as characterizing the polis in the Archaic period? What are some of the tensions in your chapter on it? You return to this mass and elite question, which is unavoidable, of course.
Yeah.
But could you say, just a little bit about your take on what we see in the Archaic period in terms of the consolidation of the polis structure?
So, it's a period I think everyone likes to teach in a way, the Archaic period. I think Vincent Azoulay, said everyone likes to teach it because it's science fiction. There's just so, little evidence in a way that you can try to fit all the pieces together. It's not true, of course, right? The extraordinary thing about the Archaic period is just how much really interesting archaeology there is, and making sense of that, I think, is important. And there's also a lot of epigraphy and a lot of great literature. So, what do you see in the Archaic period? What is my Archaic period?
You talk a lot about integration.
Yeah.
Under this rubric of the, I guess you could say, mass and elite. Would you say a little bit about that? What do you mean by integration when we're talking about the emergence of stateness?
Yeah. I think it's once you accept that elites, rich and powerful people who have unequal access to resources are in some way bound to people who don't have the same access to leisure and to resources, then what is the relationship between them going to be? Do the fat, to speak, hoi peches, have greater claim to anything, because, they're more muscular and more athletic or born of gods, all these claims, or on the contrary, are they, bound in relation to solidarity to the rest of the community? The interesting thing, what I try to argue, and that goes back to Thierry Brizard's brilliant thesis, is that, but it also prefigures, Josh Ober's analysis of Athens, is that communities where you have all kinds of differing elitist claims are not necessarily dominated by that elite, but in fact are full of competing elites who have to find ways of expressing this because the community is open and, has no entrenched power hereditary elite. Whereas communities which can be very, very austere and egalitarian may be small power groups which are enforcing solidarity in that way. Crete or Sparta, of course, are the examples of this.
Well, speaking of science fiction and what people like, I think that this also maybe that thesis could account for why people love archaic poetry so much, including myself, is because there's so much missing, or you can project so much onto it. But I was really interested by your use of lyric poetry as evidence for this period. Because it is such an interdisciplinary study, but it was so nice to see that alongside the inscriptions and the archaeological evidence.
Yes.
What do you think that the poetry that does survive, or that we think survives from this period, adds to the material understanding that we have?
Yeah. Archaic lyric, and in all of its shapes. I did a lot of readings of small bits of Hipponax and Archilochus, Archilochus complaining about people not paying their timon to the feast, and that you can see that in the 7th century communities with isomorphic associations, which, are probably about the emergence of the tribes and the constituent parts of the polis, which have this ideology of participation and equality. I think you can see that in Archilochus, and you probably can see this in Hipponax, for instance, as well. That doesn't account for the fact that archaic poetry is not just about the politics of the egalitarian community, but have all kinds of differing claims to distinction, and so on. And so you have to find a model to read that in the polis. My difficulty, in fact, is not so much with archaic poetry as with archaic law. Basically, the question is that, can you use archaic poetry to try to reconstruct a generalized ethos of community, individual, group, household, whatever state, society in the archaic period? I think you can. Can you use the emergence of written law and regulation, a little bit in the 7th century and a lot in the 6th century, to reconstruct the institutional setup across polis? That's, we're back to the fact that you have many archaic polis. You have the polis of archaeology, burial, tombs, dedications. You have the archaic polis of lyric, song, small bounded groups, warfare, and then you have the polis of institutional setup, of law, of fiscality, of public goods, and they all seem to overlap at the same time. And as you know, people tend to emphasize different things. The Aristotelian in me tends to argue that once you've gotten to the horizon of the state, it will actually constitute and determine other things. But that's a gambit, because there are many places where we don't have law. We don't have law for Bacchylides' chaos, for instance, or for Aegina, right? Aegina is producing temples, war, ships, coins, but we don't have very many. We have one or two, I think, archaic written regulations. So how do we imagine the polis of Aegina, the archaic polis of Aegina? We have bits of Pindar towards the end, right? But that's, I think, and we're back to this problem of how do we construct unity out of these very disparate materials?
For the story of that construction, it then seems that moving forward, what you call the 100 Years' War is really important locus for the sifting through a lot of these problems, and then when it comes out the other end, it seems like there is, this is when you get into the great convergence. So could you just say a little bit about why you think it's useful to look at this period of that? I think standardly in the textbooks, in the historiography, is presented as a period of competition between hegemonies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So why do you see it as productive to look at it at that as those successions of hegemonies synoptically as the 100 Years' War. I think that's a really interesting way of presenting it.
Well, it simplifies our teaching, doesn't it, for the period? Basically, we don't actually have to worry too much about the First Peloponnesian War and or whatever is going on 375 BC. It of course is is also dangerous because it flattens out a lot of things. But yeah, I think what you say is right, that the possibility of hegemony at that scale, which is an Athenian story, but not just, and the repercussion that has everywhere, like, it's impossible to understand what's going on in the Peloponnese in the early 5th century without realizing the shadow of Athens. Athens doesn't have to be directly involved. It's not whatever Themistocles in Argos who's actually like encouraging ferment, but just the presence of hegemony is actually doing things in the Peloponnese and surely elsewhere. So this is a case of atoms realigning or whatever, that creates this obsession with hegemony. And then this particular tone of the 5th and 4th centuries of this extreme violence. So the story starts in, 464 or 462 with Athens and Sparta falling out. And then ends in 362, shall we say, when Xenophon says, tarache everywhere, there's just troubles. So, this long period of troubles, I think it was, the narrative history seemed to impose it.
Yeah, I kept finding myself thinking about the very end of the Hellenica when Xenophon presents the Battle of Mantinea as just really, there is in a way no outcome. It's his reading of it, which, other scholars, both ancient and modern, challenge and see bias in his account. But I think it is very interesting that he ends with this sort of aporia, just saying that, it wasn't clear who emerged victorious, and there's even more confusion and disorder, as you're saying, in Greece than there ever was before. So I think it's really interesting then that at the beginning, or at the end of the 100 Years' War period, and then the beginning of the Great Convergence, that a really important figure for the convergence, in a way, is sort of maybe paradoxically or ironically Philip of Macedon. So could you say a little bit about how the story of Philip and Alexander and how they manage the Greek world then goes on to influence this story of the Great Convergence? I found myself thinking of Dmitriev's book on the slogan of Greek freedom in this period, and how important it is the way that Philip, when he's setting up his league, manages, he includes the buzzwords, talks about autonomy, really presents a commitment to those values that had emerged as important. So how does that then set the stage for the Hellenistic polis and the convergence that you discussed?
No, that's a very good point. I mean, I think I downplayed the two. And it was another sort of annoyance factor, at moments in the book. But I think that's a very good point. That Philip, of course, represents, doesn't he, a sort of end of the 4th century, or of the 4th century politics, in that you have the League of Corinth and its sort of federalism porn, of having all of the the Lycurgan period is trireme porn, but in that it's federalism porn. We have all the institution and the delegates and the contingents, which are proportional. All of this combined with, of course, his very particular dynamism of this conquest state, of the 360s or whatever, the 350s. And also, extremely hard-nosed politics of supporting factions and supporting tyrants and oligarchies. So you have that slightly contradictory mix, which is very, very, 100 Years' War, very, very 4th century. The realpolitik, the harshness, combined with the desire and tendency towards institutional solutions. Alexander, of course, it grows out of this, but there is like a particular accident that Alexander and his successors go the Dmitriev path of choosing local freedom as a slogan for strategic reasons or for cultural reasons. And it could have gone other ways. It could have gone the Philip solution of, cynicism, and oligarchies and tyrants, but they actually painted themselves into this corner, which is a contingent factor, I think, and I try to say this, that, it could have gone many other ways, but the result of Alexander plus the successors choosing to go not like Lysimachus, let's have oligarchical republics, but let's have actual democracies on the Ionian model, or Athenian Ionian, actually is a very important fork in the road. So I think that is how I would look at that crucial period between 359 and say 281, and that's one of the contingent factors in the Great Convergence.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating that it would be the emergence of the Hellenistic kingdoms that then really gives space for the democratic polis to breathe and flourish.
Yes, the cuckoo clock time. Yes, I think that's it. Yes, that is a paradox, and it is arguing that if you're interested in the polis, then you should actually be very involved in the Hellenistic period, very interested in the Hellenistic period, which doesn't have, of course, apart from Aristotle, if we want to claim him, but doesn't have, the Platos and the Thucydides. We have to deal with, I'm afraid, Polybius in Book 5, for instance. So it's very, very interesting stuff, but it's very different sort of material. And then the politics of the honorific decree, which Ben Gray has studied.
Well, you mentioned the year 281, which brings me to a question. I think that the inscription that you begin with about Heraclea is from 280, if I'm not.
I don't think we know when it's from.
Was it? I can remember the date that was given.
250s, 260s.
About 270, I guess, is the goats of Heraclea that you give. So we're in that neighborhood temporally.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such an interesting inscription for so many reasons. You position it programmatically at the start of the book. But I think that unlike a lot of books that begin with this kind of eye-catching vignette, it's something that you do return to throughout the book.
Yeah.
So could you maybe just, for the listener, give a brief account of that really fascinating inscription and why you see it as something paradigmatic or good to think with as we're thinking about the Longue Durée of the Polis?
Yeah. I mean, it's an inscription that a lot of people have talked about, Louis Robert, of course, the great Louis Robert, the epigraphist and historian of the Hellenistic period, wrote about it. It's this inscription. It's a block of stone. It's now on the island of Amorgos, but it seems almost certainly to come from this very small place, 17 square kilometers, island in the small Cyclades, Heraclea, which I must confess I have not traveled to, even though I've wanted to go there ever since I've read about this inscription. Now, thanks to the tourism boom in Greece, I think it actually has gastropubs and Airbnbs and everything. So it's not like traveling there in 1949 it actually used to be a difficult place to get to. And it says, the citizens get together and swear not to keep goats. And this actually will have to do with the soteria, the protection of the koinon, and that if someone brings in goats, you can stop them, and if you get killed during the affray, the community will intervene and help sue the miscreant, which is not that reassuring in terms of enforcement of the law, but is an extraordinary. And then this is actually, described as being for the good of the Herakleiotai, the citizens, but also all of those who inhabit the city. In a way, you have the whole package of the polis. I've argued, the others have not, Christie Konstantakopoulou or Pierre Fröhlich have had doubts about this, but I think the institutional setup seems to be like a polis. So, why are the citizens coming together to swear an oath not to keep goats? Is extraordinary, I think. And why do they say this is actually a vital matter of the soteria? How do the community of citizens relate to the broader community? You can see the whole poetics of to koinon and of polis are actually in there. So, it's a very, very famous text. A lot of people have talked about it. The thing that really was arresting for me and that decided me to start the book with this is the discovery in the Gennadios library in Athens of this enormous 800-page book on Heraclea by a local historian, I think called Gavalas. And amidst all this stuff, absolutely fascinating stuff about recipes, schools, the name of the captain who led the boat to Amorgos, is this agrarian history which is hinted at earlier, namely that Raklia was, when the travelers discover it, actually under the thumb of the monastery on Amorgos and peopled by tenants who paid 50%. So the alternative is not, the community of men or the community of goats, because this island turned into a goat island in the early modern period, but the island of the Cyclops, the polis, or a feudal world, a landlord-dominated world. And I thought that alternative was very arresting, that the polis is neither the state of nature nor this state of domination, but it lives in that space in between. And I think that's why I returned to this, especially toward the end of the book, because I'm obsessed by the possibility that, in fact, someone is getting screwed in this story. It's just we can't quite tell who. That's something that obsesses me as well.
After you discuss the Great Convergence and the Hellenistic history and democracy in chapters 9, in chapter 9, you move into talking about the kind of general qualities of the polis that we see in this period. Talk about the political culture that emerged from the Great Convergence. And you write that this political culture shows great unity, stability, and coherence. Could you discuss a little bit the qualities of the polis as you see them? So for instance, you single out festivals as one example of something that is an important part of maintaining these equilibria within the polis societies. So what are the qualities of the polis that then have emerged after this Great Convergence?
I'm always afraid of sounding, romantic or starry-eyed. So the belief, of course, is that they manage stable forms of local democracy on a small scale, and that the euergetism reflects the outcome of bargains between the elite, the wealth elite, in a way that doesn't allow it to transform into a political elite. So what I call the tragedy of the elites, that elites are embedded in such a way that they can only claim distinction or elite status in ways which are controlled by the people and which forces them into accepting economic burdens. Which is, the whole paradox, the Venn paradox. If the elites are in charge, why are they paying for everything very, very heavily and competing for the privileges? And the answer is both an ideology that has painted them into that corner and accept as the, terms of their eliteness, and institutional setup in the assembly and in the courts, especially the courts, which basically forces them in that direction. So it is an extension, I suppose, of Ober's model of mass and elite, and what happens when you have economic inequality and political equality that expressed through institutions as well as ideology. And then you have to have all kinds of cultural phenomena that reflect this, like the honorific statue, like the festival, like certain types of public space, but also certain type of physical setups, like the house, like the built environment, like art, for instance, like visual art, and probably, even though we don't have enough of this, the literary production of this period. Hannah Golab and I are doing this book on the forgotten literature of the Hellenistic period, which is the literature of the festival, the literature of the gymnasium, the literature of the civic library. So that, I suppose, are these forms of the Great Convergence. And to come back to this, the book is also very anxious about this. I read a book about early modern Geneva, in which the magistrates at the beginning of every yearly assembly stand up and doff their hats to the assembled people to show who is sovereign. But this author, Raphael Barra, showed that the reality is that the elites have sewn it all up, that every election is basically, a sham, and that they control law, so that you actually had very severe civil disturbances in Geneva by the late 17th and early 18th century, with a very recognizable stasis, i.e. disgruntled aristocrats taking the lead of popular uprising and being executed and so on. So my worry is that we don't see elite power. What reassures me, allows me to sleep at night, is that we don't have stasis anymore. Well, well, stasis gradually dies out at this period. But that might be another reason to be worried. It's like when the bombs don't go off, the mafia actually is in charge. So those are some of the anxieties that shadow my portrayal or my unpacking of the qualities of the polis.
Well, I think it's very interesting because you have this extremely sensitive attunement to performance and the politics of performance, talking about when you're writing about especially the era of the tyrannies. And, it is interesting to think about, as you do, how the notion of performance or civic performance doesn't die with tyranny. I mean, it is still a part of democracy, right? Yeah. And so, one wonders then to what extent some of these things that look very noble are, performative fictions as well.
Yes. Isn't that where we get to the whole theoretical problem of the performative, which, we were taught rigorously using speech act theory to believe that it actually could shape social relations. But at the same time, we're confronted with the popular use of performative, which is something that you do cynically and that allows people to live or accept unacceptable realities because they've seen like gestures, token gestures that mask relations of power. So that is really, and as classicists, we're at a disadvantage because we tend to believe what our texts tell us because we always got a pat on the head for unpacking things. And therefore, when we unpack festivals, social spaces, social discourse in a way that is complex and coherent, we may be just in fact doing the work of power, for power. The problem, of course, is where do we find correctives to this? Like social archaeology, unfortunately, has to impose meaning on material remains which are mute. And therefore, it's theoretically perilous. And it's perilous because often the meanings that are imported are just yesterday's textbooks. I'm not going to name names, but I think this is a problem we face. The law, of course, we don't know if it actually had any bite. So we have a problem of various types of evidence which are all unsatisfactory to answer these problems.
This notion of doing the work of power by attending so much to power's rhetoric is a really fascinating one. I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot with my students is the way that arguably classical Athens continues to exert soft power today. And I know that this book is not primarily a story about Athens in any way, but I am wondering, and this is partially on the basis of my conversation with Christy and with Leah Lazar, and with Leah's new book about her wonderful book about Athens and power in the 5th century. To what extent do you think that the polis that have crystallized, or the political system that's crystallized after the Great Convergence, is there an Athenian influence upon the way that some of these baseline polis structures then work? So one thing that we were talking about with Christy and Leah is the adoption of not only the epigraphic habit, but of the practice of, and this is obviously an area, one of your many areas of expertise, but with the granting of honorific inscriptions, how that works, the language of honor. I mean, to what extent does the Archaic have the way that the Athenians did things, the way that they performed their politics, have a lasting influence, or does it? Yeah, no, that's an amazingly important question. I have to read Leah Lazar's book. I think, isn't it a horrible thought, or a sort of paradoxical thought, that the spread of Hellenistic democracy might actually just map the extent of the Athenian Empire, i.e., that the islands and Asia Minor might have picked up these democratic turns because they were actually directly ruled by an imperial power, and that the slowness of Peloponnese and of Thessaly and so on, or Western Greece, to join the Great Convergence just because they weren't directly ruled by Athens. So no omelets, eggs, and all of that. But yes, to a certain extent, and in a way that poses other problems. Yes, Athens does exert an influence, and things like liturgia, in competition, are such that you can find them everywhere, and that then you get to the point when you can actually understand them thanks to Athens, because we know more about Athens. We actually have forensic rhetoric. We have these issues worked out and argued about in ways which honorific decrees say will not tell you.
problems with this. And first is, of course, that, Mogens Hansen, for instance, said, well, Athens does not give us keys, is exceptional. Whereas here we're saying, no, in fact, we have a broad culture which is kind of unitary and kind of Athens flavored. And, the extreme specificity of Hansen's approach then is cast into doubt. The other one is, for me, if this is the case, then why are we going to study liturgia at Carthaia in 280 BC rather than just read Demosthenes? Have I just not sawn the branch I'm sitting on? That if Athens is everywhere, then we might as well just go back to studying classical Athens rather than studying all of these pale copies which spread out the world. Well, that is part of the story, but not the main story. So my whole periodization just basically becomes problematic. And you might as well, in terms of studying, in terms of what the classics are, return and place Athens at its beating heart. I don't know.
Well, is there a particular, maybe a smaller polis that you have a special affection for? I was wondering as it emerged from this, but one of the first history seminars I took in graduate school was on the polis, actually, with Emily Mackel. And I remember our final project was we had to each pick a polis and do kind of a Copenhagen polis project style entry for it. And people came up with all sorts of really interesting examples. Is wow. If you were going to do a little side project on one particular, maybe lesser known one, what jumps to mind?
When I taught the polis, I did it only once at Columbia. I asked my students to write about a polis, and I stupidly forgot to tell them not Athens. So everyone just wrote their final project on Athens, much to my despair, to my complete despair. It was such a failure to interest them in anything else. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I'm working on a place called Airai in Ionia, near Teos, which, we only know about because of a Sinoikism. And it was Teos. I think it's Airai. Mustafa Adak thinks it's Airai. And there's one inscription, maybe two, from Airai. One is probably, as Peter Tonneman points out, a piece of the curses of Teos, which is really interesting. But the other one is a 350s decree, which you can see the people of Airai are actually receiving exiles. They're debating about whether to pay them a pension. And they seem to have a full range of institutions. And it's one inscription, and you have the whole package is there, politics, institutions, finance. And then if you look at the Sinoikism with Teos, you get a sense of the economy, namely that they derive their income from enslaved workers in the forest and from textiles. And just to try to imagine how the institutions and the social history map over each other, I think is very, very interesting. And I wish you could do that for every polis. I don't think we've actually done it very well for any polis. I don't think we even do it for Athens. The full social history of Athens, paradoxically, is still has to be written. I think I know Fergus Miller used to say that just to annoy people who do Greek history, but I think it's kind of true, right? We have all of these elements that would allow us to write a full history of it. But I don't think it's still there yet. Maybe because Athens, the influence of Athens is just so massive, and the object is so intimidating.
Yeah, and I think it's so complicated. It's like this hall of mirrors. Yeah. The way that the influence works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you said earlier in the conversation that you worry about sounding too romantic sometimes about this material. So I would like to point out that you have a chapter on the concept of the worst polis, where perhaps some of the scales fall from the eyes. And could you say a little bit about what your argument in that chapter, where you specifically consider forms of injustice that might have been engendered or perpetuated by the polis structure?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Other people say this much, much better than I, and I think I'm just... than I do, and I think I'm just playing catch up here. But the fact that citizenship is an idea that's so empowering, that we're in a community and that we have a say, and that public goods will come back to us, and that those who handle them will be accountable, and that we have forms of writing that prevent informal power, extra-institutional power, that we have institutions to try to protect us, is very, very empowering and ennobling, in a sort of Hannah Arendt way. But what about those who don't have access? That's a very, very obvious point. But what if it's not those who don't have access, but that the definition of the in-group is predicated on the exclusion of others, on the work of others? And that's not a new thing to say, fine. But to think about then what it is to be an enslaved textile worker, or to be a freed woman who is of a certain age and who's caring for, say, a woman in Delphi or in one of these Phocian cities, I don't know, Ambrissos, and whose life will be that. If we talk about fulfillment and human flourishing, then the thought of all those lives which are cut short and who never realize, I think, is a very, very harsh thing or difficult thing. I talk about the story of that 12-year-old boy, enslaved boy, who tried to kill his master or enslaver and almost certainly was executed. And that just gave me real pause. I found it very, very difficult to think about that. Also, if I'm reading Orlando Patterson, and the description of what it is like, based on anthropological documents, to grow up as a slave child next to the citizen, to the children of, to free children in the same family. And that is very painful. It's a very painful thing to think. And the question is whether it's coterminous with the polis, or if it's just a historical contingency because everyone is doing it, and the polis did it very well, because it does most things very well.
Yeah, the institutional framework seems to be an important part of that story. Well, so in terms of your story, the story that you tell in this book, where does it end, and how did you pick an end point for it?
Yes, I have an index card to myself called The Never-Ending Polis, because, of course, the book starts by this impulse, which is very common in people who work on the epigraphy of the Hellenistic period. The polis doesn't end in, 338 or 323 BCE, but it continues. Okay, you say, does Actium mark the end of the polis? No, of course not. It keeps going. And the question is, where does it end? Does it end with Christianity? Does it end with the 3rd century crisis? Does it end with Justinian? I don't know. The book sort of peters out in that way. It has, like the polis itself, it has many endings, because when you think that's it, the 4th century Constantinian state is it, then you have epigrams for bishops that talk about the will of the people and the reputation that, really look like civic epigram from, say, the Hellenistic period or even the Archaic period. So the polis continues as an idea and heritage for a while, and for a very long while, but it does not re-emerge in the Byzantine Empire. There's no commune until the 15th century, I think. I have to read Caldelis to find out if this is in fact completely wrong, but I think there is an end. It's just slow and diffracted until basically perhaps the 7th century BCE. But there are many ends. The end of civic finance, the disappearance of magistracies, the end of assemblies, and all these things gradually peter out during the late 4th and 5th centuries CE. But then you always get these tiny slivers of perhaps just urban living, will push you in that direction.
Yeah, it's interesting because then you have the people who are coming at it from maybe the Greek Middle Ages, working on the Eastern Roman Empire, and then, not Caldelis in particular, but then you get the kind of reverse movement that actually late antiquity begins with Alexander.
Yes, no, that's a good point, isn't it? That's a good point. And that's not something that I'm very good at dealing with, is, it's a very square book, this book. It's about men of substance, about good citizens who do their duty and vote. It's about jurymen who swear the oath. And the coolness of a world, which stretches, into Central Asia and to the Indus Valley, of, movement of ideas, connectivities, individuals, is something that the question is what is the relationship with the world of the polis, between free agents and motion. Purcell and Horden actually downplay the state, downplay institutions, and downplay the city. And I think late antiquity, the late antique model is much, much closer to that. And do these people surf from polis to polis, or do they represent, a world which is much closer to the village and the court, paradoxically above the polis and below it?
Well, I think, John, this is hardly a square book. I think you're underselling yourself quite a bit. There's really a lot of texture and I think edge to it. This leads me, I guess, to maybe my last big question, which is, I remember it was like 7 or 8 years ago that Graham Allison got asked to the White House to present on the Thucydides trap on his thesis about.
Oh.
So let's say that you were to be invited to give some presentation to the mucky mucks, the people who actually do control things these days, that was based on your research. I mean, what kind of interventions do you think? I mean, can there be interventions made for modern politics on the basis of this material?
In a way, it's a foreordained or predetermined story, because the book itself is, just to play my cards on the table, it may not appear that way because there's so much epigraphy in it, but it's a presentist book, in that it argues for a form of social democracy, getting to Denmark in the Fukuyama way, in the Fukuyama phrase, I hope not to be controversial by saying oligarchy is not a good thing. The influence of the elites, of entrenched elites, is not a good thing. Taxation is a good thing. The production of public goods is a good thing. Accountability is a good thing. And that is not perhaps unrelated to the last 8 years of anxiety, classics in the age of anxiety, is obvious. So anything I say, in a way is already said by Piketty or Stiglitz or Krugman or so on. It's, it's a very simple book in that way. But that, goes back to the, I think, liberating potential of the book, which most determined this book, most influenced it, was Josh Ober's Mass and Elite. That, there is no inevitability of oligarchy, and that democracy actually can work and actually is durable, stable, and tries to bring public goods to the largest number, rather than be a system based on spoils, which is, the alternative, the violent alternative. I think is a message of the book, with all of the worries and anxieties that go with it, that there's a price to pay, that there's violence that is embedded in the system, injustices at every corner, and that these things should not be, that we still have to stare at them in the face, because the question is whether they're coterminous or contingent again.
Well, thank you so much, John, for this conversation. I was hoping that we could end with a signature podcast word association game.
All right.
If you yourself are game. So
yes, of course.
Wonderful, thank you. So I will just throw out a few words and just say whatever comes to mind. Okay. Okay, so let's try it. So first is polis.
People.
Aristotle.
Polis.
100 Years' War.
Atrocity.
Archaic Greece.
Hoplites.
The Great Convergence.
Civic honors.
And the last is demos.
Demos? Gosh. If you say demos, of course, I'm very tempted to think of a Greek man of any age, really, listening and willing to argue with you about politics. That would be my old man Demos Pyknites, as I would imagine him. Yeah.
Your Aristophanic version, or
yeah, Aristophanic version, but in a way timeless, I think. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
Really monumental book in many ways, and congratulations.
Well, thank you, Joanna, for having me on.
No, the pleasure is definitely all mine. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.